Since the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there has been a certain degree of saber-rattling of the nuclear variety, coming from none other than Vladimir Putin. Talk is cheap in international relations, so verbalizing ridiculous threats is commonplace and does not warrant much discussion. See Khrushchev's shoe-banging at the UN or "We will bury you" declaration as Exhibits 1A and 1B. In fact, when Putin declared such threats were not a bluff, as he announced the broader mobilization in September, we specifically addressed why the media's reaction to it was overblown. However, I think we have finally reached a point where nuclear weapons could plausibly raise some issues in the conflict. So let's talk about what has me wondering here. To begin, we need to differentiate between two broad classes of nuclear weapons: strategic and tactical. The strategic weapons are those that you are most likely familiar with. They played the biggest role in the Cold War, and they are what you see in the movies about doomsday. Their purpose is to destroy as much as possible, which means they are normally aimed at large population centers. As examples, the Fat Man and Little Boy bombs that hit Hiroshima and Nagasaki were strategic. That term is a little strange, but the idea is that countries threaten their use to deter and coerce opponents on a grand scale, as part of some sort of greater strategic game. There is some cause for concern that the United States and Russia could get involved in a broader fight, with Ukraine serving as the catalyst. This would then result in the exchange of strategic nuclear weapons. Bad times all around. Fortunately, leadership on both sides have strong incentives to make that a low-probability event, and perhaps the subject of a different video at another time. The other type of nuclear weapon is tactical. These tend to be smaller weapons, deployed on the battlefield to hit oncoming armies or perhaps a supply hub or two. And these are what worry me. Think of them as artillery, but with a much, much greater bang. Unlike strategic nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons have never been used offensively. Nevertheless, the United States and Soviet Union individually worked hard to develop them during the Cold War. This is the United States' Davy Crockett bomb, the smallest nuclear weapon ever constructed. It basically looks like a fancy rocket-propelled grenade, and the whole thing weighed only about 34 kilograms. When they actually tested it, the explosion was a drop in the bucket by nuclear standards. Larger versions of tactical nuclear weapons exist as well, including this Atomic Annie cannon. Here is the Upshot Knothole Grable test, where the US fired a nuclear weapon out of an artillery device, after which it traveled about 10 kilometers in 19 seconds before exploding. More modern versions of tactical nuclear weapons are mounted on planes or trucks like regular missiles would be. For the most part, tactical nuclear weapons have lower yields than strategic nuclear weapons. This is an estimate of the 5 psi blast radius that the Davy Crockett would create if detonated over the White House, which was an obvious potential target during the Cold War. Clearly, you would not want to be standing in any of these other places in the event of such an attack. But the point is that such a small nuclear weapon is not particularly destructive. Next up is the damage from the Grable device. As the blast radiates outwards, you will see that tactical nuclear weapons can still functionally destroy large chunks of a city. Indeed, this is about the same level of destruction as what the Hiroshima bomb did. The difference is that soldiers are the intended target for one of them, while civilians are the intended target for the other. The biggest tactical nuclear weapon of concern from Russia has the power of about 100 kilotons of TNT. That takes the radius about out to here. The Pentagon is right on the edge. Of course, none of these are on the level of modern strategic nuclear weapons. This is the Topol, a bomb currently in Russia's arsenal. We are now looking at a radius of more than 6 kilometers, essentially erasing the entire capital. And this is what the largest nuclear weapon ever tested, the Tsar Bomba, would do. Now we are looking at an entire metropolitan area. Tactical nuclear weapons seem like chump change by comparison. Why might tactical nuclear weapons be useful despite their more compact blast radius? Let's talk about the current military situation in Ukraine. Things have looked bad for Russia since the start of the September counterattack. Ukraine initially made gains up north, beginning by retaking the Izum logistics hub. That scared Putin into announcing a conscription on September 21st, officially calling up 300,000 people, with the possibility of a larger number in practice. When that will start to actually pay off for Russia is unclear. Ukraine has continued to push forward in the north, capturing Lyman and its critical railroads on October 2nd. More concerning for Putin was what happened in the south. Pre-mobilization, Russia had shifted its forces to defend Kherson, which is what facilitated Ukraine's advances up north. And yet the Ukrainian advances toward Kherson continued anyway. Putin made his life more complicated by formally annexing the oblasts of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson on September 30th. Or at least he tried to. In any case, from the perspective of codified Russian law, Ukraine was now fighting on and winning Russian soil. The October 8th attack on the Crimean Bridge further indicates that Kyiv is planning for a deeper counterattack, and wanted to reduce Russian resupplies coming through the Kerch Strait. This takes us to how Putin might use tactical nuclear weapons to turn things around, starting with the simple solution, by firing away. For whatever reason, imagine that even after Russia completes its mobilization, Moscow still cannot stop Ukraine from regaining territory at will. The most straightforward way Russia could use tactical nuclear weapons here is to simply fire them at the advancing Ukrainian lines. No more Ukrainian soldiers means no more counterattack. There is the slight issue here that tactical nuclear weapons still leave behind radiation. But this is nothing like the Chernobyl calamity. It's a short-term problem for Russian soldiers downwind. Nevertheless, Putin ordering straightforward attacks on Ukrainian troops is plausible. It's just not what my primary concern is here. Such use of nuclear weapons would flagrantly violate more than a half-century of non-nuclear norms. Now, you might counter that Putin has already ripped up a norm on territorial integrity by invading Ukraine in the first place, so he probably does not care much about norms. And you probably would be right. The difference is that violating the non-nuclear norm would almost certainly have far more far-reaching consequences. China and India continue to implicitly pay for the war by importing discounted Russian energy. It is reasonable to expect that they would abandon Russia after a nuclear attack, and the reaction from the more ardent members of the non-proliferation community would only be stronger. With Russia hanging by a thread economically as it is, I suspect this would deter Russia from trying such a move. After all, Russia could use conventional weapons to accomplish similar tasks. These concerns are likely why, when the head of Chechnya publicly argued for a low-level nuclear attack, the Kremlin press secretary immediately shot down the possibility. There is also the problem with how the West might militarily respond to that, which opens up all sorts of thorny issues for Russia and the rest of the world. This is why the forward deployment itself of tactical nuclear weapons is the real concern for me. What I'm about to describe is a well-known strategy. In fact, it's one that the United States uses with B-61 tactical nukes at one of its air bases in Germany, though not taken to quite the same extreme. And previously, it was something meant to deter the North from invading South Korea. Moscow also has experience with this, most famously having placed nuclear weapons briefly in Cuba. But Soviet weapons also found their way to Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Mongolia. Imagine a world where Putin mobilizes a bunch of tactical nuclear weapons and puts them in the hands of local commanders. Then he makes an announcement. The nuclear weapons are out of his hands, leaving the local commanders the option to use them in the event that Ukraine is about to overrun their positions. What makes this attractive for Russia is that it tries to sidestep the central problem of nuclear coercion. It is best to defer the final step of escalation into your opponent's hands, forcing them to back down without you having to use your nuclear weapons. But a running joke in the war is that the United States is the second biggest supplier of Ukrainian arms. Russia is number one, given how much its soldiers have left behind over the various retreats. 4 deployments of tactical nuclear weapons leave their commanders in a potentially awkward situation, where they might have to use them or lose them. Put differently, failing to fire the nukes means that they will just fall into the hands of Ukrainians. I do not think Moscow would need to worry about Ukraine turning a recovered nuclear device against Russian troops. Ukrainian possession of such a weapon would put the country in violation of its obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The United States was a main player in convincing Ukraine to sign the treaty immediately after its independence, an effort led by Senators Sam Nunn and Richard Lugar, and enthusiasm for the treaty is still high among U.S. policymakers today. I suspect Washington would make continued conventional support conditional on disposal of the weapon, and Ukraine would want to comply with that request. But it does put the commanders in an awkward situation, where if retreat is no longer feasible, say because they are backed up against the Dnipro River as Kherson is falling, they have no choice but to launch. This, in turn, leaves Ukraine in a quandary. Does Kyiv continue to press the offensive, banking that the commanders are actually on strict orders not to fire under any circumstances, essentially calling an elaborate bluff? If it was not a bluff, does Kyiv hope that the international backlash will be so severe that Ukraine will end up in a superior position anyway? Or do Ukrainian commanders shift gears and find a new way to continue the conflict that mitigates the possibility of nuclear use? Or should Kyiv live with the status quo division and hope that Russia will implode in on itself over the long term? None of these options seem particularly good. Fortunately for world stability, I just see this as a plausible concern, and not a guaranteed problem, because there are downside risks for Putin. Even if Russia only hits military targets with tactical nuclear weapons, and waits to do so while Russian troops are on the back step, there will still be some level of international backlash. Meanwhile, even without worrying about third-party states, delegating agency to local troops has 2 main drawbacks for Russia. The first is that Putin would no longer be in control over the escalation dynamics. Local agents on the ground are not privy to the broader strategic concerns that Moscow faces. Furthermore, those strategic concerns are quickly changing, so explicit guidelines given to those agents can only go so far. Then Putin has to worry about rogue agents. One side of this is a hardline commander firing the nuclear weapon and forcing Putin to deal with an escalated conflict. This is like the previous case, except no amount of careful instructions from Moscow will stop it. The agent is rogue. Perhaps worse for Putin is the possibility that a commander would turn it against Russian authorities. Given the whispers of dissension in the Russian military ranks, Putin cannot discount this possibility entirely, though Moscow would hope that command and control systems would stop it from happening. The more immediate danger comes from what the United States might try to do to stop the forward deployment from happening at all. As far as anyone knows, Russian tactical nuclear weapons are nowhere near the front lines at the moment. The United States likely has the ability to observe any changes to those deployments. If Putin begins moving them toward Ukraine, Washington must consider whether to use conventional weapons to prevent that from happening. This, of course, would be an enormous escalation in the war, making the Cuban Missile Crisis look tame by comparison. Back then, the US put a blockade around Cuba to prevent Russia from maneuvering nuclear weapons onto the island. But Khrushchev and Kennedy worked out a settlement. Further escalation today would put the world the closest it has ever been to nuclear annihilation. How exactly things would play out from there are unclear. India and Pakistan got into a shooting war over Kargil in 1999, after both possessed nuclear arsenals. but cooler heads prevailed back then. If cooler heads were to fail today, whatever exchange occurs would be incredibly costly to Russia. Of course, there is no guarantee that the United States would intervene in that manner, because it would also be incredibly costly to the West. But the question is whether Putin wants to take the risk at all by getting the tactical nuclear weapons out of storage. And that is something that only Putin's inner circle really knows. So what is the risk? I don't think it should keep us up at night until Russia actually deploys the tactical weapons. But it should worry you. Unfortunately, I do mean that. My normal research is on nuclear weapons, and it would have been very easy for me, William Spaniel, at the start of this conflict, to play up the dangers in February 2022 to rack up the clicks. But I didn't, because I was not all that concerned about things. However, that was a different era, when Zelensky could still pass for someone who gets regular sleep. A lot has changed since then. To be clear, I still don't think that the likelihood of a nuclear disaster is all that high. The sky is not yet falling around Kyiv. But the downside risk is scary enough that it is something worth thinking about now. And for Ukraine and its friends, the secondary concerns are how they will have to change their behavior to avoid that nightmare, or figure out how to stand firm without danger, at a time when Ukraine is trying to solidify its NATO aspirations. In case of a nuclear war, be safe and wear a helmet. In the meantime, let me know in the comments what you think the risk of nuclear war is, or just accuse me of attacking the Nord Stream pipeline. Either one works. If you want to know more about the war, you will love my book that purely focuses on the causes of it. Check below for more information on that. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care. I find it odd that we live in a world where the presidents get chairs with armrests, but Switzerland couldn't be bothered to extend the same luxury to the foreign secretaries.